Welcome to Scriptural Works, a podcast that engages Scripture in new and innovative ways to produce meaning for today's postmodern world. Co-host Greg Camp, Professor Emeritus, Pastor and Biblical Scholar, and Patrick Spencer, Biblical Scholar and Silicon Valley Tech Executive, employ various interpretive approaches to generate new meaning from ancient text, revealing timeless wisdom relevant for ministers, lay leaders, and interested readers of the Bible. Get more podcast articles and other useful resources at scripturalworks.com. Hey everyone, welcome back to another Scriptural Works podcast. I'm Patrick Spencer, one of your co-hosts, and I'm here with my other co-host, Greg Camp. Greg, hi. How are you doing?
Hey, I'm doing very well. I'm trying to beat the heat here.
Yeah, and unlike some of our other podcasts that we've been recently producing, it's solo today. And it's because we're covering the ending of Matthew, which is part of our The End is the Beginning series. Some of you have hopefully listened to some of our other podcasts on this topic. We looked at Luke with Joel Green. We looked at Mark with Stan Helton. We looked at Acts with Tom Phillips. Now we're looking at Matthew with Greg, because Greg, as most in our audience hopefully know this, has a PhD, studied with Loveday Alexander at Sheffield University back in the 90s and early 2000s. And guess what? He wrote his dissertation, as well as some of his ongoing work, has been on the Gospel of Matthew. So it makes sense that we talk to him. And I'm going to learn a lot. It's been a while since I've done a deep dive on Matthew. So Greg, looking forward to this conversation. We're going to put you on the hot seat for at least the next hour, I think.
That's
and you're in Fresno, so it makes a lot of sense.
Yes, it does.
So, Greg, just looping back to the end is the beginning, what are the different ways in which you can understand what we're trying to accomplish with this series?
Yeah, the title for the series is really just something that popped up for us, but it really makes a lot of sense, and actually in a number of different ways. One is that the end of the story is already found in the beginning, narratively. The direction of the story is already found at the beginning, and that's true with Matthew. Although, as with any good movies that we would watch today, we don't always know where it's headed because we don't know how to understand the beginning initially. Another way is that the end then reflects back on the beginning, that it wraps it all back up. This is another narrative issue, that by the time you get to the end, you've now gone through the whole narrative and you can say, oh, they were already foreshadowing that from the very beginning, if it's really well developed. But a third way is that by the time we get to the end, we actually have all the tools available to us now to kind of rethink or reread the narrative. And so the end becomes the beginning to read over again with greater understanding. And that's a cyclical process that we go through. But another one that we've used in our series so far is that the end of the narrative is actually the beginning for the reader, in the sense that the end has some sort of an implication for how the reader should live their lives. And that's certainly the case with the ending of Matthew and what we often call the Great Commission. So those are things that we'll be picking up on a little bit today.
Yeah, and we've seen that with Luke and Acts, and the conversations with Tom and Joel. And well, Loveday, who you study under, one of the best articles she wrote, in my opinion, is, I forgot the exact title, Backwards Reading in Luke Acts, where she looks at Acts 28, and then she looks back to Acts 1, she looks back to Luke 24, she looks back to Luke 1 and shows how there's a connection, there's a tissue that is thread through all of those, which is a great article, and it's not a long read, yeah. So I encourage her.
Which you can't always see those connections until you finish.
At the end, exactly. So your approach and my approach, maybe why we're doing this podcast together, is fairly similar in that we are big advocates of narrative criticism, literary criticism, as well as reader response criticism. So what does that look like when we take those models and we apply them to the Gospel of Matthew?
With Matthew, what I've spent much of my career doing is helping undergraduate students understand things like the structure of Matthew, how that story is put together, what some of the writing conventions might have been that Matthew was drawing upon. Richard Burridge had a great doctoral dissertation that was published on the Gospels as biographies, bioi, and Matthew certainly follows some of those tendencies, as does Mark and Luke and John. And within that, there are roughly kind of two topics of ancient biographies. One is they're biographies of teachers or philosophers, and those biographies tended to focus on the teachings and conflicts that the teachers had, and that's certainly throughout Matthew. But there's also biographies of leaders, the biographies of the Caesars, and other significant figures in both Greek and Roman society. And those tended to focus on their rise to power, their maintenance of power, their decline from power, either by death or by being exiled or overthrown. And that's part of Jesus' story as well. So we, in terms of the subject matter, we have a biography that looks a little bit like a teacher, but also a little bit like a leader. And Matthew is wedding those two things together. Within the structure, we're also looking at how the timeline works. Narratives are obviously different than epistles or letters or poetry. They have a timeline to them. And so you can look at the sequencing of events, the flow between speeches and actions, and whether what's being said and what's being done build upon each other or help support each other. So looking at all kinds of things having to do with structure, and there's lots of different ways to look at structure.
Yeah.
But we also look for recurring themes, things that keep getting picked up over and over again. Might be in a slightly different way, or it's just simple repetition to beat it into you. We've talked a little bit in, I think, the Mark one about the secrecy theme that comes out. We've talked about disciples who don't quite understand what's going on. We looked at that in both Luke and Acts. That is certainly true in Matthew as well. The disciples are often quite clueless. One of the narrative pieces in Matthew that is very pronounced is the use of citations and allusions. Matthew loves to quote Hebrew scriptures, but it's not just the direct quotations. Sometimes it's just an allusion to something, which you have to be familiar with the material for it. And so readers who are familiar with the older literature will see things in Matthew that they don't otherwise. We also look at things like character development. Is there any character development? One of the things about Matthew is that most of his characters are fairly flat. Yeah. They don't go through a lot of change. If any does, it's Jesus. The others remain pretty much the same. And in fact, many of the individuals are really representative of a whole character group. You might have somebody like Peter who shows up, but he's really representative of all the disciples. You have no named leaders outside of the chief priests. Any scribe, Pharisee, Sadducee that shows up, that they're just labeled. And he doesn't even make a lot of distinction between those groups. So it's interesting to note that when you do some character studies. But also for Matthew, the settings, the geographical locations are important. Galilee versus Judea. Jerusalem figures very important. A place that Jesus only goes once in the Gospel of Matthew versus the other Gospels where he's going repeatedly. Mountains figure very important. So these are some of the things that we use. It's basic storytelling techniques that we look at.
Yeah. When you're going to talk about this in a bit, I think, in more detail, but you think about, biography and leaders, political leaders. Well, you look at Matthew, it seems to align Jesus more closely with the concept of David, the king, as well as Moses, who are seen as leaders. You have those connotations in the other Gospels to varying extents, but really it's in Matthew we see most of that, which makes you think of biography, to your earlier point.
Right. Even more so. Yeah.
So
and if we were to add another one to that, it would be prophets, right?
Yeah.
Because prophets confront leaders or other prophets. So, and we get the biographies of Elijah and Elisha, well, biographies, you get narratives about them.
Yeah.
Jeremiah is more. And lo and behold, Matthew likes to kind of allude to those. So you get kings, you get Moses as the lawgiver, and you get prophets.
That's great. I'm looking forward to hearing more about that and how it ties into the very end of the gospel, to your earlier point. So if you look at Matthew, there are similarities with Mark and Luke, and well, maybe not so much with John, but certainly with Mark and Luke, because they're synoptics. But there's also differences. Can you talk about both of those aspects when it comes to Matthew, and maybe how those link to the end of the gospel?
Right. If we look just at the ending, chapter 28 in particular, otherwise we're going to be here all day trying to draw out all the similarities and differences. In the
We'll do a series on Matthew
scene,
next year, I'm sure. That's coming.
The tomb scene has a number of similarities. We have Mary Magdalene and another Mary that is not specified. But we don't have, as the other Gospels do, somebody named Joanna, Salome, and other women, as it says in one of the Gospels, who came to see the tomb. It doesn't indicate that they're coming to bring spices for burial. It just says they came to see. So Matthew's really pretty generic. He's got two women, and all they're going to do is look at it. They're not going to do anything. So that's a bit of an interesting piece. The person that they encounter there, they have an angel or a man or men that are there. What is this? And in Matthew, it says that an angel descended and sat on the stone. We'll come to the stone in a minute. Whereas in Mark, it's when the women go inside the tomb that they encounter a man in there. And Luke has two men that show up. In all of them, the clothing is very similar. It's white. It's dazzling in some fashion. Some minor differences there, but pretty close. The instructions that this figure or figures give are very similar. No fear. He's been crucified. He's been risen. Come see, go tell. Very short and sweet. What are you doing here? Get out. And then what do? In Matthew,
I assume Matthew is viewed negatively, Greg. Is that how it's typically portrayed when you see fear cropping up in the Gospel of Matthew? It's in a negative manner?
Except Peter doesn't show up at the end here. Is that what you mean?
No, yeah. Fear. The concept of fear.
Fear. Yeah. Fear is sometimes associated with a difficulty in believing faith. So when the disciples are in the boat, they're afraid. Obviously, there's a great storm. And so there is, that parallel. And so Jesus chastises them for having little faith. So yeah, the fear can be deemed as unfaith, but yet they go and they tell, which is not something that happens in Mark.
Yeah. They go away, they're afraid. Yeah.
Right. In that regard, Matthew's like Luke in that they go and they actually tell somebody. Yeah. But you don't have anybody running back to the tomb because the message is go to Galilee.
Yeah.
And so nobody's going back to the tomb in Matthew. So one of the differences, the uniquenesses in Matthew is that Matthew's the only one who has an earthquake. When the women show up, there's an earthquake that rolls away the stone and this figure that comes and sits on it. The others don't have that. Matthew also tells of an earthquake when Jesus dies, which the others don't.
You think that's because it's more apocalyptic in nature than the other Gospels? Do you have an opinion on that?
It could very well be that the heavens and earth are giving a response to this in a way that's important to Matthew that's not necessarily for the others. You also have a very curious addition in Matthew that the others don't have about what the guards do. We would say today they were scared spitless or scared stiff, right? They're watching what's going on, but they can't do anything.
Mm.
but they're seeing everything apparently, because then they go and they report back to the chief priests and tell them everything that's going on. So at the end of the story, you know that the chief priests have the information that Jesus has been raised from the dead, the tomb is empty, and they concoct a story to say that the disciples have stolen the body and so forth, which is very much part of Matthew's drumbeat of antagonism between the leaders in Jerusalem and Jesus.
Yeah.
And that episode is just reinforcing that notion. But he's the only one who has that. They do have one encounter with Jesus as they are leaving the scene. And as these two women are running away, Jesus meets them and hail.
Yeah.
It's just such a curious thing.
And odd.
That's all he says initially, right? And they fell at his feet and they worshipped. Very unlike what's going to happen in John, which is, of course, so very different. And he repeats what is said by the man or angel. Don't be afraid. Go tell my brethren to go to Galilee, and there they will see me. So there's this emphasis on going to Galilee. Don't be afraid. Don't stay here. Get up there, which is going to be that final scene. And that scene in Galilee is unique to Matthew. And there's a number of places where I think the scene in Galilee plays important that we'll come back and talk about. But it certainly allows you to reflect back on what you read in chapter 4, where when Jesus goes to Galilee to begin his ministry, that it's the light is shining on Galilee of the Gentiles. I'll quote that a little in more detail later. And so now we're going away from Jerusalem back to Galilee. Some of the other things that aren't in Matthew, there's no Emmaus Road. There's no meeting in Jerusalem. Thomas doesn't get to doubt there. None of that stuff's happening. There's no ascension because Jesus is going to say, I will be with you until the close of the age. So there's no ascension. Yep. So the similarities and differences are helpful to us since we have multiple gospels to kind of compare them. But early readers may not have had multiple gospels. They just had the one. So part of what we have to ask is, what do we make of the story as we have it in front of us if you didn't know what wasn't being said or what's being added that others don't have? Yeah. And that brings us back to these narrative techniques. How do we put together what we have in front of us here?
That makes a lot of sense. Now, you hone in on just that last passage, was it 28, 16 through 20? Are there some structural elements there that readers would pick up on, whether they're listening to it or they're actually reading the text?
Yeah, if you take that passage and kind of section it down into the different pieces that are in it, first of all, they have to go to Galilee rather than staying in Jerusalem. Well, it's consistent with an anti-Jerusalem element that's throughout Matthew. Unlike the other Gospels, Jesus only goes to Jerusalem one time, and that's where he fights with the leaders. He's tried and he's crucified. And immediately upon his resurrection, he's back up to Galilee.
Yeah.
So Jerusalem is really the place where Jesus confronts the religious leaders of his day, and they kill him, and he's back off again. Unlike the other Gospels where he's kind of trotting down there, not quite every other weekend, but certainly for festival days that we get to see quite a bit. He's got groups of friends and family perhaps down there. Not in Matthew. One time. So there's a very antagonistic view. So Galilee's going to play a much more important role for understanding Jesus' ministry. Second is that they go to a mountain, which stays with an important kind of scene setting that happens throughout the gospel. We have several things that are going to happen on mountains. We're going to have temptations. Jesus teaches on mountains. He prays on mountains. He's transfigured on the mountains, and he has confrontations on the mountains. So these occur with obviously the temptations in chapter 4. He teaches the Sermon on the Mount in 5 through 7. He's at prayer on a mountain in the episode where he then comes and walks on water in chapter 14. Again, he's praying when he comes down, and he heals and feeds the 4,000 in chapter 15. So initially he's on a mountain praying, comes down. The transfiguration happens on a mountain. The fight that he has with the leaders in Jerusalem is on Mount Zion, on the Temple Mount. And so that's its own kind of mountain. The eschatological discourse, this is Matthew 24 and 25. After they leave the Temple Mount, they go down across the valley and up on the Mount of Olives. And so Mount of Olives is a critical place. Of course, he goes to pray at Gethsemane, and that's where he's arrested. And that's on the Mount of Olives. His crucifixion happens on some sort of a mount, a hill or something. And then you have this Galilee episode. So mountains are where critical action happens.
A lot of hiking involved in that.
A lot of up and down. I'm becoming more vertically challenged in terms of climbing all those. Jesus didn't have that problem. One of the other things that we see structurally in these last few verses of Matthew is that the reaction from his followers, these 11 that it refers to, is that they both worship and doubt. And there's all kinds of things that you could begin to wonder about the doubt. The worship is like what the women did when they encountered him at the tomb. Worship just means to fall on your face, right? Proskuneo is to fall down and do obeisance to somebody. The doubt part shows up a number of times. So let me start with the worship piece. I think there is a significant place early in the gospel that pairs importantly with the ending. And the worship is part of the third temptation that Jesus faces. And what the Satan says to him is, bow down and worship me, and I will give you all the kingdoms. And so this action of bowing down to worship, what the disciples are doing is bowing down and worshiping Jesus. Mm-hmm. Jesus never bows down and worships Satan. And it's right after they do that he announces that he's received all authority, both in heaven and on earth. So there's this connection between the temptation, what's being asked of Jesus, and then what the disciples end up doing, and Jesus announcing, well, I've gotten all of it, and I didn't have to bow down to Satan. The disciples worshiped him after calming the storm in Matthew 14, where they say, truly, you are the Son of God. Right? Now, doubt is mentioned in that same episode in Matthew 14, when Peter steps out of the boat, looks away, becomes frightened, doubts, starts to go under, and Jesus chastises him for being a person of little faith. Right? Why are you doubting? So worship and doubt, while they're not mentioned very frequently, they are connected to Jesus as the one in authority. So worshiping and doubting has to do with Jesus' authority or their lack of belief in his authority. So again, it doesn't happen very often. I wouldn't do a whole paper on this, but I think it's critical to remember that the doubt isn't the same kind of doubt as Thomas. I doubt that he's been raised from the dead. I doubt that you're anything more than a spirit, or this is doubt about his authority, would be the argument I would make about the ending of Matthew. And so I think it's summarizing a key challenge in the gospel about whether Jesus is in fact the Christ. Not only the Christ, but also the true teacher. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment, because it becomes this summary statement. You see me here. Do you now believe that I am who I've been claiming to be, both as the teacher and as the authority figure? So in his final statement, one of the key pieces then is his this thing that we usually call the Great Commission, where he initially states authority. And that takes us back to the very beginning of the gospel.
Compared to the other gospels in many ways, right? It's,
yes,
exactly what
very
to do.
much so. Yeah. Well, and in the beginning of Matthew, I had this sudden lightning bolt strike me one time when I was teaching the end of Matthew, where suddenly the beginning of Matthew made a whole lot more sense, where the beginning is Biblos Genesios Jesu Christu, which is often translated as literally it's book beginning Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
And people translate that as a record of the genealogy of Jesus the Christ, because what comes after is this list
Right
of
afterwards,
names.
the genealogy. Yeah.
And so they make it as they change book into a record of, and they change Genesios into a genealogy. Where I think what it's actually saying, this is the book of the beginning of Jesus the Christ.
Huh.
The whole book is the beginning of Jesus the Christ. And what he's announcing at the end is, okay, now all authority has been given to me.
Hmm.
So the whole book is about how he gained that authority.
That authority. Hmm.
And that translation difference at the front end sets up the whole story in a very different way.
Interesting.
And I think we're led astray by having this list of names that comes right after that. So in most ways, I think that Matthew is the book of the beginnings. It's the genesis of Jesus as the Christ. How does he get to be that? So the book itself is then a long story of the beginnings that culminates in this statement of authority, which then sets in motion a new beginning, which is what the
That has a command and participles after it and all that fun stuff, which I'm sure
exactly.
You're
Yeah. So it also, I think, ties back to that third temptation that I mentioned. You know, the first temptation was turn these stones, you're hungry, so turn these stones to bread, which anticipates Jesus' interactions with the crowds who are poor and many of them suffering illnesses and diseases. So that particular temptation seems to be reflecting the challenge that Jesus is going to have with the crowds, that they're needy and desperately so.
They're pressing upon him. Yeah.
And the question is Jesus going to meet those needs? Well, yes, he does. We see him meeting the needs all throughout, which seems contrary to what the temptation is about. Nothing for me, thanks. I'll just keep going. But it's not that it's not important that you have bread. It's that there's something else more important. It's two relative goods. And that's going to be one of the things that he'll have a challenge with the crowds on, meeting their relative important needs. But there's also something more important that they also have to get, which has to do with loyalty to God and so forth. For Jesus, that's going to mean his own death, which takes you to the garden scene. Not my will, but yours, and so forth. The second temptation is that Jesus is taken to a pinnacle on the temple. It's a particular walkway on the upper level of the temple, and to jump into the court where the priests would be, as a sign that God has chosen him as his Christ, and that God will protect him. And this anticipates the antagonism of the leaders who are going to constantly ask for signs of his authority. And of course, they don't believe in his authority. And then we get that third temptation, which is the invitation to receive the kingdom, all the kingdoms of the earth, if he becomes subservient to the Satan. And I use the because it always appears in both Greek and Hebrew with a definite article. And I think it's a title, not a name. And so he's saying no to that. We're mostly familiar with that. And that really parallels his teaching with his students, the disciples, who want him to seize the kingdom by divine power, like other kings would claim to do, and to bypass the suffering. They don't want to hear him talk about suffering. They just want him to come in with the angels and conquer and kick a little backside and take over. And he's refusing to do it that way. So that third temptation is largely about his own students and trying to get them to understand that there's a different way that the kingdom and the Christ will come into being. And so he's going to refuse that. And he's going to go the way of himself being rejected. He's going to suffer. He's going to be crucified. And then he's going to encounter the resurrection before he announces that all authority has been given. So we tend to think of Jesus the Christ in the gospel, but he only announces it at the end. And he doesn't have quite the secrecy motif that Mark does. But yeah, he kind of pulls away from that, and he's announcing it at the end. So I think that's this statement of authority is a critical piece here that goes back to those early temptations. But then we get the command, the specific command. And a lot of translations turn these into multiple commands, but there's one imperative and three participles. And there's been plenty written on this. And the imperative is make disciples, which I would rather translate as make students, of whom? All the ethne. Well, how do you want to translate that? Do you want to translate that as nations or as Gentiles? Yeah, we'll come back to that one. And I think what it's, by using that notion of making students, what it does is make Jesus primarily the authoritative teacher. Right? Emperors don't have students. Teachers have students. So I think that's a central theme of Matthew, is Jesus as the authoritative teacher. And then the participles, the ing words, are going, baptizing, teaching. Going, okay, just as you're going anywhere. Baptizing in the Trinitarian formula of Father, Son, Spirit. But almost nothing is made of baptism in Matthew.
Yeah.
So you're just not given anything. Luke Acts has got to fill in that hole for us. Teaching, okay, that has loads of stuff in Matthew, of course. All that I've commanded you. Well, what's he commanded? So this is where this is an important statement to make the reader stop at the end and think through, okay, what has he commanded? Not only his teachings about the law, which happen in Sermon on the Mount, chapters 5-7, which has to do with the nature of righteousness that needs to surpass the standard that they know, the scribes and Pharisees. And the Sermon on the Mount has two parts. Chapter 5 is really about the law, but those are laws having to deal with your relationships with other people. The 5 examples he gives are murder, adultery, oaths, retaliation, treatment of enemies. It's just 5 examples. It's not supposed to be comprehensive. And so he's saying your approach to the law needs to exceed what you've been taught. And let me give you 5 examples of what it means to exceed. And so Jesus is the authoritative teacher, not only about the law, but also in chapter 6 through the first part of 7, it's about relationship to God. Well, what are the traditional ways that you have positive relationship with God? We would say forms of piety. We translate righteousness as piety in this case. Is alms, giving money to people in need, prayer, of course, fasting, forms of security, which make up a bulk of chapter 6, and then whether or not you judge others or judging yourself. These are all ways of showing devotion to God. And so Jesus is the teacher about how one loves others and how one loves God, right? Which is how he summarizes the core of the law in chapter 22. Upon these, all of the laws and commandments hang, loving others and loving God. Actually, he has it in the reverse order, loving God and loving others. Well, that's not the only place he's taught. He also took time to teach his own students in chapter 10, what we call the mission discourse, because he's sending them out. But it's less about going out than it is about loyalty in the face of hardship. He spends a lot of time telling them not to take anything. They need to be trusted. They'll be cared for. They're going to face all kinds of difficulty. Are you up for the task? It's almost like the coach before the big game saying, you're going to get your tails kicked and be ready for it. But you need to get out there and do this. And here Jesus is teaching them about the cost of loyalty to him. In chapter 13, the parables chapter, this is about the nature of the kingdom. He's teaching them a couple of things. I think there's about three major things that are happening in that chapter. One is that the kingdom is not going to be anything like what they've experienced. This is a kingdom that instead of coming in like the Romans did, big sweeping power, this is going to be a kingdom that starts small and insignificant, but it will grow massive. It's going to be a kingdom that does not come in and decide who is for us and who is against us, who fought for us and who fought against us. We got to get rid of our opponents, keep our friends. He's like, no, that judgment's going to be delayed. So this is not a kingdom that actually even gets rid of people who've harmed you. That's just not for you to do. And the third is that there's this ultimate cost, the selling all to receive the kingdom, which he has two parables to tell about. So one of the things that he's been teaching that you have to remember at the end are things like loyalty, the nature of the kingdom, the laws, what he's taught about that, how to have reverence to God. In chapter 18, he's taught them about greatness because they're arguing. I love this scene. You've got these guys walking along this country road in Palestine, and they're arguing about who's the greatest. It's like, seriously, none of you are. And Jesus reverses their notions of greatness. It's not what you think. It's those who care for the least, those who look out for reconciliation, those kinds of things. And one of the things that he's taught them by his arguments with the leaders also has to do with how the law is understood. And that happens throughout the gospel, but there's a huge summation of that in chapter 23, which was my dissertation topic. And so again, if you're remembering what he has commanded you, what he's taught you, you have to remember really a bunch of teaching. It's like pulling out all your lecture notes. And then finally, the long piece that ends his teaching sections is what we often call the eschatological discourse, which is Matthew 24 and 25. Because it's called that because his students ask him, so what is the sign of your coming in the close of the age? The final things, the eschaton. And he takes the opportunity to, I think, so I'm going to summarize it. Have you paid attention to what I've been telling you? It's not going to be very pleasant. But what I want you to do is to care for the least. And that's the very last. It almost sounds like a parable, but it's a statement of when the Son of Man comes with power and he sets up the thrones and he's judging the nations, like sheep and goat, he's separating them. And here's how they will be judged. Based on how they've treated the least of these. And how you live now is going to have consequences. So just the notion of making students and teaching them what you have been taught, that's been a whole career for me, teaching Matthew multiple times a semester to lots of people, mostly because I think I'm thick-headed and I need to hear this over and over again. There's just an awful lot that is there. And then he has this statement that's almost a throwaway at the end. And I'll be with you until the close of the age. There's no ascension. He's not going anywhere. There's no coming of the Holy Spirit. All that stuff's missing. It's like Jesus is going to just be there. The teacher's always with you as you're supposed to be doing these things. Yeah. So it's a fascinating ending. Abrupt because it's summarizing basically a statement about everything you've read. I don't have to repeat it all.
Yeah.
There's something else I just want you to know. Go out, make these disciples, teaching them, right? And I'll be with you.
Do you think Jesus portrayed as an authoritative teacher and all the teaching that occurs almost like Torah-like, right? There's 5 major speeches and so forth. Is Jesus, you're thinking in some of these other connotations that you just cited, and it seems, shortly after 70, fall of Jerusalem, or things are really tough when it was written. And there's also an intercommunal conflict taking place in terms of who really is the right rabbinic teacher within Judaism.
Oh yeah.
That's probably evinced by, all this emphasis around positioning Jesus as a great teacher, a great prophet, and so forth.
Yeah, I think that has to do with some of the first century context. I would say that there's actually 6 teaching blocks because everybody lops off chapter 23, which is Jesus. I mean, it's teaching. So I think there's actually 6. So the whole Moses Book of 5 stuff is like,
Goes
okay,
away with that.
come on, people, you don't count the way I count. But the Jesus, the interpreter of the law, and by law, the Torah, it's not merely commandments, statutes, those kinds of things. It's much broader. He's not replacing Moses. I have not come to abolish the law, I've come to fulfill it. But then immediately he's saying, Moses, the law says, or Moses has said to you, but I say, as if it's contradicting. No, it's amplifying. He said this, and I'm going to say this.
Yeah.
It's a different way of understanding that. It's not adversative, but it's completion kind of language. So he's clearly being portrayed against other teachers as the teacher. Well, then you're going to ask, why? Why would that be such an issue for Matthew in a way that it just doesn't come out to the same degree in the other gospel writers? And so, yeah, let me come back to that, but I want to introduce that a little bit by saying what else precedes it, and that's a strong familiarity with the Hebrew Scriptures. Matthew makes no quotations in the ending of, or even allude
everywhere else, but not at the ending, right? What happened to him?
Not at the ending. So why the heck did he suddenly leave this out? Well, Matthew is, other than the teaching blocks, one of the things that he is so significant about are all the quotations that he gives.
Yeah.
He's just constantly doing this, which has led people to say, well, he's writing to a Jewish audience. Well, I think that limits what God-fearers would know, that Gentile converts to Christianity would have been. What's their scriptures? Well, it's the Hebrew Scriptures. So they're being taught in this. So I don't buy the whole thing that Matthew is a Jewish gospel and it's not implicating Gentiles at all. But there's the quotations. I would say he does some funny things with the quotations that are really an audience very steeped in Scripture would not need him to say. Sometimes he over explains things. It's like, wow, if you got to say it that way, this was done according to this specific prophet, right? Rather than just making the reference. According to the Whopper commercial back in the 1980s, where's the beef? No, you just say, where's the beef? And those of us our age would catch it.
Yeah.
He over explains sometimes. But I think that the using the quotations up to this point is helping the reader to understand the events that are happening to Jesus by reference to an older event. And one of the things that Matthew loves using is this was done to fulfill what was spoken by the prophets. And there's a long history of understanding that as prediction fulfillment. Somebody said it hundreds and hundreds of years ago, and now it's finally come true. It's like Nostradamus. But the term for fulfillment is pleroma, which is to make fuller. And so we'll have to do a whole session on these citations and allusions. But the notion of fuller is it happened once and it's happening again. But a more full and complete. And in many ways, that's what Matthew loves about citing the Old Testament when he's not quoting specific laws that he's having fights about with people. And I think it's shaping the narrative with Jesus as the fulfillment of Israel, as the faithful Israel, where
Mm.
Israel's been unfaithful, he's faithful. Whereas Moses was the teacher, he's the great teacher interpreting Moses. Um, the other kings, which Jesus Christ is basically a king, right? The other kings failed. Jesus isn't going to fail. I mean, there's all kinds of these things that are happening, and so the places where this fulfillment, making bigger, the Emmanuel passage, the son, my son I have called out of Egypt, which is clearly a reference to Israel in that original, but now it's being used about a person.
Yeah.
Uh, resisting the temptations, right? This is the Exodus problem, constantly being tempted and failing. Jesus doesn't fail. So he's repeating the history of his people, but he's remaining faithful rather than unfaithful. It's almost like a reversal of the Deuteronomistic history,
Yeah.
where the Deuteronomist cites, all the places where they failed. He's telling the story of Jesus and saying, yeah, but this guy didn't. He was good. He's a teacher like Moses, but he's the authoritative one. He's also a prophet. And this is when you try to figure out what's Jesus most like. Is he like Moses, the lawgiver? Is he like David, the king? Is he like Jeremiah, the prophet? Well, he's all those things.
Yeah.
Because he's fulfilling all of these roles. And Matthew loves Jeremiah, both in terms of allusions and citations. Matthew has a preference, it seems, for prophets at the end of kingdoms, which would be the 8th century prophets of Isaiah, Micah, Hosea. He doesn't quote Amos, at the destruction of the northern kingdom. So as it's falling apart, he quotes them a lot, and those quotations are very important. Jeremiah at the destruction of Jerusalem and Judah, the southern kingdom. And so he pulls these quotations from prophets at the times when the north and the south are collapsing. Well, and if you want a post 70 date for the gospel, okay, fine, it's fine. But clearly Matthew is setting up Jesus' story as this whole enterprise is failing and it's going to collapse. I think that's part of what the citations of the prophets do. But he's clearly the ruler. He stated this is the book of the beginning of the Christ. But by the time you get to chapter 22, he says he's got this funny argument with the leaders saying, well, who's the son of David? Who's David referring to? Well, the Christ can't be the son of David is the logical conclusion that argument comes to. And they're left dumbfounded. And that's the last argument he has with them. The Christ can't be the son of David. And you're kind of left, what do we do with this now? Is Jesus the son of David or isn't he? Well, in some ways, he's bigger than that, right? He announces that he's the one who rules over both heaven and earth. In that regard, he's a lot more like Daniel, who he does quote, where the Son of Man is coming on the clouds and he will sit at the right hand. This is a person who's both heaven and earth ruling. So he's got a bigger notion. This notion of pleroma, fuller, bigger than anything else. There's also in the quotations, especially as Matthew loves quoting Isaiah, the places where he quotes Isaiah is a lot of stuff that has to do with Gentiles. And in that we have the quote in chapter 4 where Jesus goes to Galilee, and it says, those in Zebulun and Naphtali, land of the Gentiles, the people who sat in darkness have seen a great light, and for those who sat in the region and shadow of death, light has dawned. And so this is why Jesus is in Galilee, but he's back in Galilee at the end of the story as well. And so Matthew's often accused of being anti-Gentile, or at least not concerned about anybody but the Jews, right? I only go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. But these quotes from Isaiah and the very end of Matthew points that that's a simplistic response.
Yes, otherwise, yeah.
Yeah. And Matthew 10, don't go to the Gentiles. But he says, when you suffer, you will be a testimony to the Gentiles. So in the same speech, he's doing both. Chapter 12, when Jesus is healing and he's not seeking to draw attention to himself, Matthew quotes the servant song from Isaiah 42, which he quotes, and he will proclaim justice to the Gentiles, and in his name will the Gentiles hope. But he's healing Jews.
Jews. Yeah.
So it's really more about the nature of justice, but he throws in this Gentile piece. I think Matthew's a little bit more complicated about the whole Jewish and Gentile relationship.
That scholars typically give him credit for. So if we're a first century reader, Greg, we alluded to that a moment ago, and we're looking at Matthew, and specifically, the close of Matthew, how do they actualize, how do they process, this ending of the gospel? Now what? What do I do? What's my? You've talked a bit about how their understanding of Jesus as the great teacher, authoritative teacher, but also someone who's even more than the prophets and more than Moses and so forth. They understand that, but what do they do once they hear the ending of Matthew?
Yeah, I part of this has to do with, of course, where you situate it and who's hearing, because people will hear things different. That's part of the challenge of reader response criticism, is anticipating what multiple kinds of readers might hear. And I learned this long ago, both at church and with my students, is you have 30 students in the room, they're going to hear 30 different things. And so what's maybe a set of parameters of what's legitimate to hear? You can't hear that he's saying something about UFOs and aliens, and all right, that's a little bit far out. But can you begin to say, here's a range of options? Yeah. One is, I think this story is going to make a lot more sense for readers who have that understanding of the longer Jewish tradition, Jewish history, the familiarity with the laws, some of the expectations around adherence to laws, and Jesus' unique way of framing that. And not just laws, but the whole history. I think it would make more sense to people who are familiar with some of the controversies within Judaism, but also within Jewish Christianity and Gentile Jewish relations within the church around the role of Pharisees, priests, temple practices. The further away from that we get, the more misunderstanding happens. So I think it's going to sound different early rather than as you get further away from those realities. And part of the challenge in scholarship has been to help reconstruct some of those first century realities. I think as people read the story and see what's happening with the disciples or / students as frequently misunderstanding the nature of the kingdom, of the king, of what's appropriate behavior, of the law, that's got to be a bit of a challenge, because if these guys don't get it, does that help comfort me a little bit, or does it push me? I need to know more. Maybe we're stuck in our understandings that we need to get past. With the crowds and Jesus' work with them, there's a real challenge about what might be labeled as just delayed gratification. Jesus doesn't always heal everyone. He has great compassion upon them. But at a point, he stops doing that and he dies, or lets himself be killed, to say, no, maintaining life at all costs is not appropriate. There is this thing about loyalty. And I think that's going to be a big challenge. So just looking at it by different character groups within the story, there's lots for people to reflect on. But I think the commandment itself at the end is one that has to make us scratch our head a little bit. What does it mean to make students of the ethne? How do we translate that, first of all? Right? Because you can translate it as either Gentile or nations. Nations mean one thing for us. Gentiles mean something else. What if you're in this this Jewish Gentile debate that we see going on in Acts and Paul's letters and such. Jesus is saying, go and make students of the ethne. Well, does that include Jews? Or is that non-Jews? Or is it both? So I think part of it is how are you going to understand that terminology? But then it begins to contribute to an understanding depending on where you're placing it in that first, second century. And I'm not
the dramatic impact of if you're in the middle of the war or right after the war, it had
exactly
lasting effects on Judaism and Christianity, and the debates that played out as to what was the identity of Judaism, what is it going to look like, and that's Jesus is an authoritative teacher, because there were other rabbinic teachers at the time who were doing the same posturing as Matthew in many ways.
Oh, right? Absolutely. Yeah. And it fits a little bit more with what we had the discussion with Jenny Heimerdinger about what is the nature of first century Christianity. And Jenny had a more robust conversation happening earlier. Tom Phillips had it moved a little bit later.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty agnostic about the timing. I would point out that I think that the argument that Matthew has to be post 70 is on pretty thin ice. Most people kind of take it for granted, but I would say, well, it doesn't have to be. The reference to the desolation of the temple in chapter 23 is not the same terminology for destruction. It's abandonment. Your house is going to be abandoned by God, which is reflecting, it's an allusion to Ezekiel's vision of God leaving the temple and heading east with the exiles to Babylon. That's the abandonment, the desolation of the building. The reference to not one stone remaining upon the other in chapter 24, Jesus is using that as a dismissal of the disciples' comments about the beauty and grandeur of the temple, of the building itself. And he says, this building, not one stone, right? It doesn't have to be that the building's going to be destroyed, that the author is reflecting the destruction of it, but that it's doing away with their focus on the grandeur, which apparently it was pretty spectacular. But I don't think it's proof of the author's knowledge. And the tension between Jesus and the leaders is evident in all the Gospels and Acts, and reflects, as we've talked with others of our guests, the kinds of tensions that are going on in early Christianity about the nature of the law, rather than a parting of the ways. I think it's far too soon for that here. I think it's just something that happens for a long time within early Christianity. And what the heck do we do with Gentiles and the law? And what's the nature of the law and so forth? So I think there is the Matthew could also be seen as coming from a place where there's a debate about the meaning of what it means to be a Christian, where you have both Jewish and Gentile audiences, and they're going to hear this a little bit differently. For Jews, he's reinterpreting the law to say, all right, we've always been taught this, but now Jesus is saying, no, this is what it's really like. Gentiles might hear it as, well, do I have to be circumcised or don't I? I don't know if that's their primary concern. It would be mine. But circumcision, of course, is never mentioned in Matthew. That's just not an issue yet. But it is a teaching about the law. What are they supposed to keep? If you keep the law, what does that mean? Or is this a kind of antinomianism that's arising? And I just don't see that as happening. Warren Carter likes to place it in Antioch. There's quite a few people who follow that lead. But if people like Richard Bauckham and others are correct, then the Gospels are really written for general audience. But that doesn't mean they're without context. And the context could still be a Jesus movement within Judaism where you have Gentiles joining. And now we have issues that arise. And the
Loveday argues that these were distributed in social networks, so it's not necessarily one community, but a group of communities. But to your point, they could all be contextually connected, right? They may not be disparate, entirely different communities, but they have, common denominators that can be attributed to each of them.
And I think it allows you to have different people reading it with different emphases, much like people read today.
Yeah.
I'm okay with that.
Speaking of that, how do we read this today? We talk about modern day hermeneutics. How do we take, this thing that was written 2,000 years ago and apply it to readers today? You've done that many times in your classes and from the pulpit, I suspect.
Well, I did it from the pulpit once, and it was not, the time in the pulpit was fine, but afterwards we had a Q&A. It got a little ugly. I'll get to why in just a moment.
So don't preach Matthew.
Oh, no, preach it more and more, brother. This passage is often associated with missions and evangelism within the broader Protestant world, and particularly in the Mennonite tradition that I come from. My Master of Divinity was in world mission, and I had quite a number of colleagues and friends that went to or came from various spots in the globe as missionaries or training for that. And so my life has been circled with global understandings, and this go passage was often part of that.
Yeah.
And also understanding the variety of the church globally has been very enriching. But I'm keenly aware of the shortcomings when we associate this passage just with missions and evangelism on forefront. Let me just pick out four things. One is when the go is taken to mean a cultural, political, economic, religious imperialism. Excuse me, go and kind of create little mini-me's. And our article on the website delves much better than I can into that. I think some of the authors we look at there brought out a lot of sensitive issues, and I would agree with their concerns.
Yeah.
A second shortcoming is where the command is not only go, but more narrowly focused on save souls. You go to save souls. That's what I was raised with. And count the baptisms. And that's how you know you saved souls, where you get a baptism. And there was a lot less emphasis on teaching what Jesus taught, which is, in fact, the central command here. And I think that partly comes from our Reformation heritage, where the punishment for sin and escape from God's wrath is a main focus. Well, that's just not, excuse me, that's just not in Matthew. Yeah. The teachings of Jesus are secondary at best in that kind of a milieu. But the final teaching in Matthew 25, where he says all the ethne are brought before him and are judged, well, they're being judged based on what the king expects. And what's expected is how they treated people. So this notion of service is certainly a part of this. And so what happens when we read Matthew 28 through kind of a Pauline lens that's been skewed by a Reformation focus on grace alone, no law? Of course, law is bad, and we have to escape God's wrath because we can't keep the law. And so suddenly Matthew 25 begins to sound like we're trying to earn our own salvation through good deeds, and this kind of dissonance that is going on. So I think there's just been a hard time reading Matthew as a whole, and then reading 28 correctly, or at least not within this narrower side. So when you read thoroughly through Matthew, it's hard to think that you can reject part of Jesus' teachings when that's what he's telling you to do. And of course, there's similar kind of problems that's happening with Sermon on the Mount and so forth. I think a third shortcoming is making go the command rather than going, which is just a normal event. But sometimes the go is like there are special people set aside to go, right? You become a missionary. Well, I don't want to go do that, right? I don't want to do evangelism. Well, if you're just going, it means what we do every day. And if the command is to teach, well, we do that every day. I don't know how often I did it in a coffee shop where people sat down to, often the workers would sit down because I was so familiar to them, and we just talk about things. Well, that's teaching. Um, I think a fourth dimension that's been created is this division, as I've mentioned, between missions, evangelism, and services, and the command to make disciples entails teaching them what Jesus taught, and we have to keep in mind all those things that he taught, and if we focus on that rather than on our traditional notion of missions, um, then I think we all are constantly engaged in this. This isn't for a specialized group; it's for all of us. And so, the imperative as make disciples, or as I like, make students, is again not imperialistic, but it's a directive to help others study and follow the life and teachings of Jesus. Our task is to constantly pull back to who Jesus is. And Jesus is the authoritative teacher and interpreter of the law and the kingdom. And it's not a simplistic go follow the law, but you have to be aware of what's Jesus done with the law. Again, we have to do an episode just on Jesus' interactions with the scribes and Pharisees and what he taught about the law, because it's just so different than what we've perhaps been raised with about the nature of the law or about the nature of the kingdom. That's another one that I think is very significant.
Yeah.
And then finally, Jesus as the Christ. I think for us, we have to keep reflecting on what does it mean for Jesus to be the Christ, the King, not just Savior, not the other terms that show up in other Gospels or some of Paul's writings or the other epistles. Jesus is asking them to participate in developing a kingdom of students who learn and are transformed by what they learn. And that's clearly something that has to be engaged in with intentionality. You don't just learn things by osmosis. You have to be intentional in this way. And I think that's one of the things that I wish people would pull away from Matthew, not pull away, but to get from Matthew, is the necessity to constantly study the life and teachings of Jesus. And of course, not just in Matthew, although that would be my preference, but in all the other Gospels. We'll let you have a shot at John here next time. And I think this is, by focusing on Jesus the King, we're actually fulfilling what Deuteronomy, the law in Deuteronomy about kingship, Deuteronomy 17, was said to be the one primary mark of the king, that the king would have the law in front of him every day so that he could learn how to ensure justice and righteousness. So here we have a king who's going to ensure that. Well, if we want justice and righteousness in our world, we need to be studying this. So,
and I think we would be remiss if we talked about this already at various junctures of the podcast, but you have this concept of make disciples. Stephen Barton, who I studied under at Durham, wonderful man, great scholar. His doctoral dissertation actually was on discipleship in Mark and Matthew. He couldn't just tackle one gospel. He had to tackle two.
It's too much.
I wouldn't have done that, but he did.
Yeah.
That's sort of a bellwether book that has influenced a lot of scholarship over the last, probably since it was written 40 plus years ago. But talk a bit about what this concept of make disciples means.
Wow, we should have Barton on too.
Yeah.
That's, it's not make mini me's. It's not dictating, here's what you have to know. It's an old style of education. But making students is to bring people in to want to learn, to help them know how to engage in the questions, how to engage in the tradition, how to engage in the literature, to think deeply. That's part of what Jesus is trying to show, is how you engage the law. And here are ways that I'm giving you examples of how to do that. I'm not going to go through all the laws and do it. You have to do it. And so to make in education, we talk about lifelong learners. How do you help people do that rather than saying, here's the truth that you need to know. I will lecture to you, you take it down, stick it in your brain. You're kind of a banking model of education, Paulo Freire talks about. Making students is a bit more complicated. And it's not just verbal, it's also by your life coming alongside people. And it's mutual. After a while, it's not just that you're giving out, your co-students. And that's one of the things that Matthew says to his students in Matthew 23. You're not to be above one another. You're to be fellow students with each other. And so making students implies that you're making yourself a student simultaneously. Much more involved, I'm sure, but we got to leave something for other episodes.
Well, speaking of that, we're probably out of time. This has been a fascinating
As
conversation,
usual.
Greg. We should do more of these one-on-ones more often.
Well, the next one, I get to do this to you. So looking forward to doing that on the ending of John, which has so many fascinating pieces.
It's not quite as prescriptive, well, it might be, as Matthew. We'll find out, I guess, in that episode.
It's definitely different.
Yeah. Well, for our audience, thanks for joining us for another Scriptural Works podcast. Check out other Scriptural Works podcasts on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, or your favorite podcast channel, or just go to our website at Scriptural. For other podcast episodes of Scriptural Works featuring co-hosts Greg Camp and Patrick Spencer, as well as a variety of different special guests, visit us at scripturalworks.com, YouTube, Apple Podcast, or Spotify. And don't forget to check out the growing repository of podcast companion articles found at scripturalworks.com. And finally, if you find our podcast episodes thought-provoking and helpful, make sure to share them on your social channels.